Welcome into a fresh new episode of the Stay Green Podcast, part of the Bet the Board Podcast Network, talking all things NASCAR as the playoff races continue to heat up. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host on this fine program, Chris Werme. And Wormser, busy show for us today, not necessarily from a handicapping standpoint, but we have one of the best news breakers in this space, who was gracious enough with his time, and Jeff Gluck sharing his perspective on a landmark day potentially for the sport.
Yeah, I'd love to take all this credit. Like we had someone book him this morning after the breaking news that we saw. However, this was dumb luck, and every now and then,
it tends to happen. We booked Bob Pockrass in advance of his altercation where he got photoed and he's around Ricky Stenhouse and Kyle Busch.
That is correct.
As luck may have it, leading up to yet another Superspeedway race, Jeff was gracious enough to offer up his time. We booked him late last week and got his perspective on matters that we have absolutely no idea what the hell we'd be talking about.
Yeah, this was not our forte. However, the way that Jeff talks about it, which I'm so excited for our listeners to hear, some of the biggest news in NASCAR maybe we've ever heard, at least since he's been covering the sport in 2004. But ultimately, head into a Superspeedway race, which obviously for us, not great for betting. However, that does allow us to bring in someone like Jeff and to have breaking news this morning. It certainly is a little bit of a fortuitous break for us here at the Stay Green Podcast.
For sure. And for those folks who have tuned into the Stay Green Podcast all season, Stage 1, all about the racing recap of what we saw unfold at Kansas and how we may be able to apply some of those lessons going forward. Stage 2, the aforementioned interview with Jeff Gluck, talking about the ongoing lawsuit and exactly what that means for NASCAR and how he sees the potential implications changing the sport. And while normally we'd break down a little bit of Talladega, since it's a race we don't bet ourselves, we'll do a quick playoff reset, look at the odds board, and see if there's anything that's caught our eye. So let's go back and look at the race we saw unfold at Kansas. Not nearly as exciting from a finish standpoint as what we saw at Kansas earlier this spring. Kudos to Ross Chastain, drives the car into victory lane, and suddenly the one starting to gain a little bit of momentum with 3 top 5 finishes over his last 5 races. But I don't think it was as straightforward as it looked, with Ross Chastain finishing 1, William Byron, finishing 2. We've talked about trying to get it all together and not writing him off for dead. But you thought there was a seminal moment in the race that completely changed the pecking order and ultimately the way tickets were cashed.
Sure. With about 10 to go in Stage 2, crew chiefs had a decision to make, and that was, do we flip the stage or do we try and score stage points? And at a track like Kansas, where I would say tire wear is, I wouldn't call it a high tire wear track, but it's certainly not a medium tire wear track. It's kind of right in that zone of medium to high. But whenever there's a caution with about 10, 12 to go, it's not like you're going to go green one lap later, right? You have to clean the track or there has to be some sort of adjustment to the track or the safety crews need to clear a car. So they ended up going green with about between 4 and 6 to go. And whenever that happens, yes, of course, these cars that decided to flip the stage, which was 18 cars, you're going to have fresher tires if you stay out. But does 4 to 6 lap fresher tires mean much at Kansas? I thought after the spring race, yes, that it would matter. And so I was okay with some of these drivers that decided to stay out and take stage points. However, so many cars stayed out, and the tire wear wasn't quite enough to where there wasn't enough lap time variance to where all these cars that stayed out ended up restarting so deep for the start of stage 3, and with only 105 to 110 laps in stage 3, it was going to be really hard for them to make up that ground. And I guess the question is, if you're running 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th place, and you are a playoff contender, and you can guarantee yourself 3, 4, 5 stage points, okay, maybe 5 stage points makes sense, but if you're going to only score 2 stage points, you're only going to bank those for the round. Is it really worth staying out and scoring those stage points, or is it better to flip the stage and then be the leader of stage 3? So it was kind of this moment that I haven't quite seen in the sport in the last few years where, gosh, staying out at a high tire wear track typically doesn't make sense. However, gosh, it didn't make sense in this scenario, and all it did was put guys that that didn't need stage points, the guys like Kyle Busch, the guys like Ross Chastain, got them to the lead, and their cars were good enough to stay out front. So who knows what would have happened if we did kind of keep the same, I guess, sequence, the same order, and we didn't have that caution. I think this race plays out very differently, but it was one of those moments where, gosh, do you stay out and take the stage points, or do you pit and take tires and then flip the stage? It changed the entire race because it took the fastest cars, put them in the back, and they weren't as fast working through traffic. So clean air is still king here at Kansas.
I was going to say, can we say that they're the fastest cars? If you can't pass cars and work your way through traffic, I'm not sure we can call any of the cars the fastest cars because we didn't see any comers and goers for the most part. It became more of a track position race above all else. It wasn't like the Xfinity race that we watched the day before where Eric Almirola basically drove across the entire state of Kansas to the checkered flag and was able to drive into victory lane because he could ride the high line. He could pass cars. I watched that Cup race on Sunday, and it felt like it was a short track, which with so much buildup leading into Kansas, the level of excitement we've seen a mile and a half, I didn't feel like anybody could really race his way through the field and go, all right, you get shuffled back. You're still going to have an opportunity off a restart to drive from 20th into the top 5. Things break the right way. There's a little bit of tire wear. And lo and behold, you're right back there, searching for the win. I never got that feeling for the race because, look, Kyle Busch had an outstanding chance to win the race, and I don't feel like he was one of the fastest cars.
No.
I could watch that race another 10 times and still not tell you who the fastest cars I saw were in the race.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes, whenever we have a hard time, we look back at the race, and you don't know who the best cars were specifically, and you can't say unequivocally this was the best car. Man, that's going to be hard to handicap, right? I would say if I had to just look as objectively as possible, I would say Ryan Blaney was the one guy that was able to restart 4th, 5th, 6th, and at one point 14th and drove back up to 5th. And then he was also able to drive to the lead. So I would say in cleaner air, not clean air, like not running up front. I do think that 12 car was kind of the best car throughout the day. But the minute he was mired in traffic, he had the loose wheel, he actually needed a stroke of luck to get back up there in the top 5. Ultimately, the Xfinity race with Eric Almirola, they continue to put on the best show on earth. I think him running that high line and then actually kind of diamonding off the corner, finding a little bit of speed to pass Cole Custer was timed perfectly. I think it's important we talk about this, not necessarily for Homestead, because a lot of people will say, well, high tire wear, this is going to be similar to Homestead. No, Homestead, if you stay out for 5 or 6 laps at Homestead, you are going to get your doors blown off. So this is not going to happen at Homestead. But a place we could see it is Las Vegas, where I would say Las Vegas has a little bit less tire wear than a place like Kansas. So I think just moving forward, if you're live betting, just be very conscious of that caution that falls between 15 to 18 laps to go. As long as you're in your window to make it on fuel to the end of the race, whether you need to pit one more time or you can make it to the end, ultimately you need to keep that in mind, because I do still think that at a place like Las Vegas, that clean air matters more than tires. And we saw that at Kansas. I didn't think we would, but ultimately I think it's something you need to keep in the back of your mind for next year's fall race, not the spring race. The spring race, I still think everyone's going to pit if there's 8 laps or 12 laps to go in the stage, because ultimately you're trying to win the race. You're not thinking about banking 2 points that early in the season.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating thing because it's a game of chess that's ongoing, especially knowing how difficult this particular stage is and the level of uncertainty that we'll see at Talladega, we'll see at the Roval, and it's still one of the more head-scratching things. I know we talked about it previewing Kansas, and I don't want to harp on it. That mile and a half have been the lifeblood of this sport, at least for the most part, and we don't go to a mile and a half for basically 5 months of the season. Then we get 3 mile and a half tracks to close out the postseason. We're talking Kansas, we're talking Homestead and Las Vegas, and while they're not all the same, it's just bizarre to me that we haven't been there since Memorial Day weekend and the Coke 600. But then again, if you're going to ask me to try and figure out how NASCAR goes about their scheduling, I'm going to have similar answers as I will the charter system, which provides the perfect segue as we wave the green, white, checkered flag on stage 1. And we talked to Jeff Gluck about everything that's unfolding, at least in the legal system, and what it can mean big picture for NASCAR with an interview that we recorded with Jeff early on Wednesday morning. Thrilled to welcome on a guest. He joined us last year on this very podcast to talk about all things playoffs and NASCAR storylines, and a fortuitous bounce for all of the Stay Green listeners this week. You can follow Jeff Gluck on social media at Jeff_Gluck. You can read his great work at The Athletic, but most importantly, if you're a NASCAR fan, a bettor, or anything along those lines, you need to be listening to his Teardown podcast each and every week after the race concludes with his coworker and colleague, Jordan Bianchi. And Jeff, when we talked a little bit about trying to have you on the show, I had no idea that there was going to be breaking news in the NASCAR community today.
Yeah, maybe not just breaking news, but maybe the biggest NASCAR news of like the last decade plus. I don't know. I mean, I can't think of a bigger
Dale Senior
story. Yeah, I mean, honestly, right? Like,
yeah.
I've been covering NASCAR since 2004, so I really can't. I mean, now you don't know what's going to happen. We're talking about this lawsuit, antitrust lawsuit with the 2311 and Front Row Motorsports filed. Like, maybe nothing comes of it, right? But there's certainly a big chance that this could be a groundbreaking, earth-shattering type day for NASCAR in history when you look back at it. And yeah, it could very well be turning out to be that kind of story. I just can't think of. I mean, typically, NASCAR sort of, this guy got a concussion, or there was a big wreck, or we were talking about waivers with Kyle Larson, and stuff doesn't really break beyond the NASCAR bubble that much in terms of news. So this is a big one.
Yeah, this sounds like a potentially fundamental change to the way the NASCAR conducts its business from a revenue share standpoint. Impacts drivers, impacts team owners, impacts sponsors. I mean, everyone in and around the sport. And while I know it's still pretty fresh in the grand scheme of things, can you kind of paint a little bit of a picture in terms of some of the intel you have around it? I mean, Chris and I have talked at great lengths about how influential Denny Hamlin is as a driver. I know you're part of the Dirty Mo podcast network like Denny, and that's given him a platform to really make waves. And in my opinion, a good thing for a sport where all of us kind of go, you know what, it's so insulated the way it operates that now maybe there's a little bit more transparency and potential opportunities that could exist for all parties involved.
Yeah, I mean, look, NASCAR has been doing things the same way for 76 years, right? Which is being controlled by the France family, who founded the sport and still controls it and runs it. There's never been a CEO who wasn't a France, right? Like it's only been them. And they're grooming the next generation beyond the current guy, Jim France. Ben Kennedy is a member of the France family. And so this is a family business. It's a private business, but they're being accused of being a monopoly, right? Like they're saying, hey, you guys have bought up all the tracks. You've bought up some of the competitor racing series. You have exclusive deals with, where no other stock car series can run at the tracks that you run at. You own the next gen car. You own all the parts of the next gen car. So even though we buy the parts in the cars and spend $3 million a year just in parts, NASCAR owns all those. And so you can't race that car anywhere else. And this is the only car you're allowed to build, because this is, they changed the model now where you have to buy it from them. So, it's sort of like in many ways, it may fit the definition of a monopoly, right? Like they control everything, every facet of the sport, and dictate everything. And so, they almost got all the teams in line to sign this new charter agreement, this extension, but two teams are holding out, and it just happens to be two guys with really deep pockets, one of being Michael Jordan, who, as we know, doesn't like to lose and takes things personally. So this is his next battle.
Yeah, I mean, it's just wild to see. And I think, when you look at 2311, the opportunity they've been afforded to be able to go out there, make some of these waves is because they have someone that's got the cachet, the clout, and more importantly, to your point, Jeff, the financial wherewithal in Michael Jordan to go, you know what, I don't care if I lose. We're going to try and create that level of trust between the ownership of NASCAR and everything else. Did find it fascinating that Jim France as an individual also be called in all of this, then may have to eventually open up his own financial statements to figure out exactly what the salary looks like. A far cry from something like F1 where we can bitch and moan about the way that sport's run. But as a publicly traded company, I mean, Liberty Media has to disclose a lot of that information that's out there. And while they may want to keep some of those engine manufacturers out of the sport, we at least know what those financials look like. But definitely something we're going to be following. And no doubt you and Jordan will be the ones breaking a lot of that news as more information becomes available. But Chris, I've hogged some of the floor, so you can fire away your questions at Jeff, whether it's about that situation or anything else that's on your mind, and we continue to look at the way this playoff race has unfolded thus far.
I guess just a quick synopsis about kind of what happened in the last 24 hours, where we're at right now, and then what are like the next 2 or 3 steps? What needs to happen? I was kind of in the dark this morning when Todd shot me a message. We were planning on having you on, and he said, "Oh, Jeff has an emergency podcast." I'm like, "What do you mean emergency podcast?" And then a quick sign on to Twitter with just enough time to kind of read a little bit about the lawsuit. So what are the kind of the basics of the lawsuit? And then what are the next steps? And then what's the timeline, I guess, for something like this to kind of, I guess, resolve, if that's what the word would use?
Yeah, so basically, I think that there's a couple goals here. And they don't need it to go to trial, because before the trial, they have to have discovery, which is where you turn over all your financial documents and all that stuff. NASCAR historically has kept that extremely close to the vest. Nobody really knows. You know, we know what the TV deal is, right? Like next year, for instance, they're going to be making $1.1 billion a year. The teams will get a percentage of it, blah, blah, blah. But all the other revenue sources NASCAR has, how much the tracks are really making, how much NASCAR, the executives are really making, all that kind of stuff. We don't know, right? Like, and also, by the way, you know, NASCAR with the single source suppliers, like, do they get a piece of that? All those kind of things. There's probably a lot there that they really don't want out. And if this goes long enough, they're going to have to turn over all those records. As you said, Todd, Jim France is going to have to show how much he's pocketing from all this, right? And, you know, so they're telling the teams, well, we're giving you as much as we can afford to give you. And the teams have been like, we'll open our books, you know, because we'll show you that they claim, the teams do, that, you know, they're losing money or barely breaking even. And so even if this doesn't get to a jury trial, the finances are going to come out publicly, which is going to be absolutely fascinating if it gets to that point.
Man.
I mean, we will see truly the inside stuff of, you know, how much every team is making. What is attendance down? Is attendance up? Like, what's really going on? I mean, it's just going to be wild. So, but before then, the charters expire December 31st, right? So, like, these teams, if they don't sign the agreement, which they didn't, they're standing to lose. I mean, the charters have sold for $40 million. They're probably worth 50 or more. So is 23XI going to lose $100 million worth of charters? Maybe. But to make sure that that doesn't happen while this case is going on, they're trying to file for an injunction where the court would say, listen, because this legal process is playing out and you could be harmed by financially by the length of this trial or whatever's going on, we will allow you to continue operating under the terms of the charter deal until this is all settled and finalized. So to me, maybe it goes to trial, but I think that I think the teams want NASCAR to settle and just give them what they're looking for, whether that's permanent charters, whether that's more control over the rules, whether that's more money, you know, from other revenue sources aside from just TV. They're not getting any of what they want right now, it sounds like, and they don't feel like NASCAR negotiated with them fairly. So they're like, all right, I think the lawyer said, we don't want to go from a grade D deal to a D plus. We're looking for a pretty significant jump. Yeah. So I think that there's a pathway for NASCAR to give them something, but we don't know how it's going to play out as of now.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, is there a chance it doesn't even get to discovery, or does that have to happen? Can NASCAR come to the table and say to 23XI in front row, okay, you called our bluff. We're here. We're ready to make a deal. We don't want this to go any further, and then they automatically get this B plus or this A minus or an even deal, whatever they want to call it. Is there a chance that happens, or is this going to get to discovery?
I think there's definitely a chance, depending on how much NASCAR doesn't want to show their records, right? Like, I've always heard that that's such, you know, who knows what's going on in the sport? Oh my gosh, they don't want to show this. They'll never be transparent. They'll never really tell us. So if that's true and they really don't want to, you would think they'd go, okay, whoa, right? But I also think they're probably extremely pissed. Like Jim France is probably furious. Oh my gosh. So this guy is not going to want to go down easy either, right? Like, he's going to try to do something, pull out all the stops. And this is just setting up to be a titanic heavyweight battle. But look who's involved on the team side, right? Jeffrey Kessler. Like, this guy, he just did the college athletics. He just broke up the NCAA monopoly, basically, right? He got equal pay for the U.S. women's national team. Before that, he got NFL free agency. He got the NBA salary cap. I mean, this guy has had something in every sport, and he's out there today saying, this is lawyer talk, but he's saying this is the most egregious example he's ever seen. So it's like, I mean, if he feels like he has a case, buckle up.
This has got the potential to be extremely interesting from a NASCAR fan standpoint. And then you love the fact that one of the seminal figures in all of this is a driver for one of the most prestigious teams and an owner at the same time. You'd love to see the France family potentially go, you know what, Denny? We don't think you should be in a ride for JGR and a charter team and see what they can do there. You mentioned the TV deal and the $1.1 billion that's going to be coming. We'll have TNT entering the fray, Amazon on the streaming side. We know the Xfinity Series exclusive deal with CW going forward. In your opinion, when you look at more media partners being involved, good for the sport, challenging, or are you anticipating that we're going to get some revolutionary caliber broadcasts where some of these networks are going to go outside of their comfort zone to kind of change that viewer experience for the NASCAR fans and what we've grown accustomed to?
I think it's a positive because for me, like each of those partners is bringing something different. Like you have sort of the more traditional broadcast element with a Fox and an NBC, right? Like that you've had. But when you have Amazon coming in for the streaming element, I think that's big. And then like even getting Turner Sports, like that's big in the sense that, they're bringing in Bleacher Report, right? And you've already seen Bleacher Report starting to do content now or like House of Highlights, stuff like that, right? Like stuff where NASCAR wasn't really playing before and they weren't really featured in things, like since they've been off SportsCenter and things like when ESPN was promoting them hard, like it was a whole different level of attention and relevance in the mainstream. When that kind of stuff goes away and you're not being talked about on some of these channels, and that includes internet channels, right? Like that's big. So to me, just even getting on like Bleacher Report stuff, as small as that might sound, like that's significant. So I think it's a positive. And then still having the broadcast side of it too, like with the CW, it's going to be on antenna, you can find it, right? Like, so it's going to be, it's not just going behind a paywall, right? Like going exclusive streaming.
Yeah, that's always the big part for me is the availability to try and grow the sport from a grassroots perspective, as much as anything else as we enter the streaming universe and know the frustration that NFL fans have gone through when you try and calculate exactly what it costs to watch every NFL game through Netflix, through Amazon, through YouTube TV, and everything else that's out there. But it should be interesting to see some of the fresh personalities, perspectives, and the way that these various entities go about things. But, enough about kind of the business of NASCAR. I mean, we could talk to you for hours about that kind of stuff. When you look at the current construct, I mean, we head to Talladega this weekend, one of the more unpredictable races. Chris and I have talked about the first two stages of the postseason being extremely unpredictable with the way the schedule has set up. Do you think NASCAR has it right for the 10-race playoff format, the way it's done? We hadn't been at a mile-and-a-half track since, Memorial Day weekend until we went to Kansas last weekend, and suddenly we're talking about mile-and-a-halfs in that round of 8, ultimately determining a playoff champion but figuring out who gets to Phoenix. If you were sitting at home trying to figure out the perfect format and the race construction of the playoffs, are you happy with the way things look now? Should we be trying to get away from Phoenix for the championship? I mean, Chris and I will debate this until we're blue in the face, but it comes through the lens of being a gambler more so than a fan of the sport.
Yeah, look, I just want to see the most credibility overall, right? Because, I like it when it's entertaining, but I mean, I was a sports writer first before like I got into racing. And so I want to cover like true competition, like actual sports, right? Like I don't want something where, let's handicap the guy who's the best all year to see if we can, mix things up. And now we got this kind of this out in left field guy who won one race and he's the champion kind of thing, right? Like I would rather see something that I'm like, this guy's the greatest, this guy's the best, he deserved to win, he performed at the right time. And you can argue maybe the one race championship does that, but racing is so much different, right? Like because the field changes all the time. So different people are good on different surfaces essentially, right? And it's not like the NFL, the Super Bowl is being played on a triangular field or something, Yeah. And you're like, well, this team's not good there. They're screwed. So to me, I don't really see what was wrong with the 10 race format. Like, where you reset. But even if you look at the season long thing now, I mean, maybe I'm too much of a traditionalist or something, but especially like, look, the next gen cars and the parity, they're all so equal, I don't think you're going to have somebody hit on something and blow out the field and win the championship by like 200 points. You're just not. Like, if you look at the overall season standings, even now, there's like, I don't know, 5 guys within 50 points. So what's wrong with that? Like, letting it naturally play out. But if you want to have a playoffs, I'd be cool with 10 races. When you're eliminating people left and right every 3 races, and you're putting these, I mean, these are like landmine rounds, right? Like, they're designed to blow things up. They're designed to try to trip up the top guys. And it's like, okay, like, yeah, are we going to celebrate that if Kyle Larson gets in a wreck this week, he's maybe eliminated, like, after being one of the best all year? That's a positive, I guess, if you're into the entertainment. But to me, I'm like, I'd rather see him going for the championship. I'd rather see the 4 best going for the championship and going at it, you know?
I think you nailed it. I was going to say, Chris, and I'll give you a second to jump in. I mean, just talking about how, you know, this is almost the Jimmy Johnson rule in effect, that the 48 was so good they had to try and find a unique way to try and upset the apple cart. But given the parity we see at the sport, even from the top teams and the top drivers, I mean, the regular season was the perfect illustration. I mean, that thing went down to the bitter end to figure out who was going to be the regular season champion, and knowing how close all of these drivers and teams are. To your point, you'd rather see the best in the sport get rewarded more so than being able to avoid the big one at Talladega, be on the right strategy at the Roval, and just avoid some of those landmines. But go ahead, Chris, jump in, buddy.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking, we haven't really had a season where, I guess, Ryan Newman, I don't know if it was like 2011, 2012, where he was like running second at Homestead, having not won a race. You know, what would have happened had he won? Would they have really taken a look at the playoff structure? But now you look at, you know, kind of this season where it seems like to me that throughout the entire season, it's been Bell, Larson, Hamlin, and probably Reddick that have just been, you know, the fastest cars most of the season. There's no guarantee that they get to the Final Four. You know, what happens if we end up with a, you know, like a Suarez somehow making it through or winning, you know, this week or next week? I think that the next round of the playoff races, you get through those, you deserve to get to Phoenix. But I see guys with the opportunity to fall off at this, you know, with a playoff guy not winning at Kansas, which I didn't even think was going to happen, right? It was, what playoff driver is going to sleep the next 2 weeks? What crew chief is going to sleep the next 2 weeks? To, oh man, Larson had issues. A couple, I thought, mistakes by crew chiefs on stage 2. What happens to the sport if you do see, let's just say Larson, Hamlin, and Bell don't make it to Phoenix? I don't know if that happens, but what will be the perception from fans as to what the sport looks like in the future?
You know, I think Blaney winning last year was the closest we've come to, you know, a champion and everybody going, okay, I guess. I mean, the Newman example, the first year of 2014 that you're talking about, the first year of the elimination format, they basically changed the rule because at the time there was no playoff points and it was just a straight up reset every round. So that made them kind of add in playoff points a few years later because they're like, we can't have this, right? Like, and so to me, if you have, like, let's say Bowman wins, right? Bowman's kind of hot right now, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's doing well, but like, is he the champion? Is he the driver of the year that is the champ? I think a lot of people go, man, what the heck? Like, Bowman, like, he's the winner. Like, he almost got fired. So I think if you have a few in a row like that, like a Blaney, a Bowman, nothing against those guys, like they're playing under the rules, but I think all of a sudden you go, man, it's hard for me to get as invested in this because I don't really know what I'm watching all year. Like, I think that these guys are the best and they're not even relevant when it's the title. So yeah, I don't know.
It's just a wild storyline and something that we'll all keep tabs on as NASCAR fans. I know, Jeff, we've eaten up a bunch of your time, wanting to get to a lot more topics, but you are a busy man. We'll encourage all of our Stay Green listeners to follow you on social media at Jeff_Gluck. Make sure you're listening to the Teardown each and every, well, I guess I should say Sundays, but sometimes on Saturdays after the race with Jeff and Jordan, and the storylines that we'll be following from the business side of NASCAR that'll no doubt have lasting ramifications for handicappers as well. Enjoy the race this weekend at Talladega, Jeff, and hopefully you can avoid the big one yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to stay off the boulevard and stay out of the infield for that. But no, thanks for having me on, and hopefully it won't be another year before I can hop back on here.
Outstanding stuff from Jeff. And for those listeners out there going, man, we hope we were going to get a little bit more perspective on Talladega. Jeff was an extremely busy man today.
Yeah.
And the fact that we were able to get that much of his time. So if it felt like an abrupt ending apologize to all the listeners. We'll look forward to getting Jeff on, maybe before the end of the season, if not early next year. But, man, I kind of hope that, 2311 wins this suit. We get to see the financials of NASCAR.
That would be nuts.
There. We'll know exactly what people are making. We get a little bit more competitive racing. But I don't put it by NASCAR to try and find a way to exact their measure of revenge or pound of flesh, depending on what you want to use, in terms of Denny Hamlin getting himself into a bit of hot water and maybe just being an owner instead of a driver, or the pressure that they could put on Joe Gibbs. But fascinating to see this unfold. I know nothing happens quickly in the justice system, but over the next year and a half, it has the potential to have seismic impacts on NASCAR as the sport we love.
So, Todd, I got to ask you a question. Do you think NASCAR has to open up their books, yes or no? Like, what would you set that price? Like, or do you think that they just agree to something?
I mean, this is a giant game of liar's poker. I mean, my whole thing is if NASCAR agrees to the demands that these other teams are making, then I'm going, you know what? I want you to open your books.
Yeah, now you want it more.
Yeah, and if NASCAR says, we're not opening the books, then it becomes a staring contest to see who blinks first. So I think it's going to be fascinating from a leverage standpoint and everything else that unfolds. And I do wonder because, as Jeff said, I mean, this isn't some attorney that they paid as a public defender.
Correct.
No, not to the public defenders that are out there listening to the show, but this is one of the highest profile litigators and lawyers out there that's worked with the major leagues. We saw, some of the other Dirty Mo personalities have him on their shows already. So this is going to be a big storyline. And look, when you have someone that's got the brand cachet, the pocketbooks, the bandwidth, and everything else, Michael Jordan's not going to back down from a fight because NASCAR wants to try and put him in a corner.
Yeah, there's a part of me that, if NASCAR just agrees to whatever the demands were with 23XI and front row racing, and I don't know that maybe Jeff Gluck went over what their demands were, or they wanted an A+ deal. Could you imagine if NASCAR is so afraid of opening their books, they just go, okay, we'll do the deal. We'll do the deal. Whatever you want, we'll do it. That, to me, shows like a sign of guilt that...
I mean, look, the way I see it, and again, this comes from an extremely uneducated perspective. So I know our listeners who are a lot smarter than me are going to call me out for being a dumbass, but that's never stopped me before. Sure. There's no reason that the charter system, the way it's set up, shouldn't be a franchise fee. You see those values of those rights go up. Like if I wanted to buy... the Arizona Coyotes, and I'm Ryan Smith. Here's the number that I can get on the free market. That tells me what a team is worth. It shouldn't be any different in NASCAR. You have $1.1 billion that we know are for the media rights deal that Jeff highlighted. There should be a rev share that should go into driver salaries and sponsorships and everything else. There's no reason for this sport to run successfully that everything shouldn't be an open book. I know it's not a publicly traded company. It's never going to be like Liberty Media having to disclose exactly what goes into F1 and everything else. But from an economic standpoint, for the overall financial viability of the drivers, the teams, the sponsors, I think it just creates a much better dynamic. And selfishly, I want to see the best drivers on track. And the only way we get that is by drivers that can go out there and earn rides based on the merits of their own qualifications, not those that are coming with sponsors behind them. And it's even worse in F1, where you can buy your ride with only 20 seats on the grid. In NASCAR, if you find a kid that's working his way up through Legend Series or midgets or anything else and he can drive, then you know what? Joe Gibbs can go, I'm not worried about sponsorship. I know where the rev share is going to come from. You're going to have a seat as long as you're out there competing and that you can win races to make our race team that much better.
Yeah, I would say I agree. I don't know much about this stuff. This is obviously not my forte, and I think that you spoke very clearly about what your thoughts are. I just don't know. I'm just very curious what NASCAR's making. I mean, that would be just, I feel like bombshell information because it could be extraordinarily low or extraordinarily high. I would guess more high than low, but ultimately I just don't know. And, it's, man, it's, I just was kind of shocked to see it. And we were very lucky to get Jeff because, man, when we ultimately had the interview scheduled, it was for a certain time, and then he had an emergency pod, and we're like, what's going on? I'm traveling. Todd's working on football, and then we just log on to Twitter, and it's like, ooh.
Bombshell.
Okay.
Bombshell, baby. Bombshell.
Bombshell stuff. So big thanks to Jeff for coming on. Absolutely great for him to make some time for us.
Spoke about things more eloquently than you and I can as we sit here and postulate on things well above our pay grade when it comes to trying to pick winners on a week-in, week-out basis. And as we said, If you were expecting a preview for Talladega in Stage 3, you're not going to get it here. It's a race that Chris and I are open and honest with all of you, our listeners. We don't bet it, and so we're not going to sit here and make picks on a race where we're not putting skin in the game. Do I think it's worth watching? There's no doubt about it. There will be plenty of drama. You will see a playoff contender wreck out early and potentially see his season come to a screeching halt. Who that'll be remains anybody's best guess. But when we look at the standings as we get into Stage 3, I mean, no surprise in terms of the way the betting odds are structured. Pretty much throw a blanket over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 drivers from Christopher Bell, Kyle Larson, Ryan Blaney, Denny Hamlin, Tyler Reddick, and William Byron. Selfishly for me, when I look at the road ahead, I'd love the price on William Byron to drift out a little bit because I think the 24 is capable of doing what the 24 did last year, lying in the weeds, testing, figuring it out, and somehow going to find a way to show speed and potentially be one of those 4 cars that makes his way to Phoenix. I guess if there was a driver I was worried about at a short price tag right now, look, Tyler Reddick all season long has been a model of consistency. He's now mired in the worst 3-race stretch that we've seen from the 45. And I'm not going to say it's time to hit the panic button, but it's not what you want to see when a driver should be hitting his stride, much like we saw from Ryan Blaney last year, where he caught lightning in a bottle, and there wasn't anybody on the grid that was going to get in his way.
Well, I think to just add to your concern for Tyler Reddick, he's been a great car at Kansas in the past, and he was non-existent. It was almost like he was just kind of an afterthought, running, over 10th place for most of the race and not making up positions. Usually when that high line comes in, Tyler Reddick also finds speed. The fact that 45 team wasn't able to find speed, and not only has that been a successful track for Tyler Reddick, just that 45 team and 23XI in general, they've been fast. So for them to not excel at a place where they've been fast in the past might be a little bit of a sign. However, we are headed to Talladega, where we've seen a little bit of success out of Tyler Reddick and 23XI in general. And then we're going to head to a road course in the Roval. And gosh, I wouldn't count them out, but man, there's been so many things that have happened that seem like externalities in the sport, whether it's a speeding penalty, which I know that, drivers do have a little bit of control over, but Kyle Larson running over something, have a slow leak at Kansas. No one saw that coming. And I was trying to explain to someone the other day when it was, well, you bet on NASCAR for a living, and what's the hardest part? The hardest part is not knowing
finding the fastest car.
Well, sometimes that's easy. It's just not knowing what you don't know. If you're Martin Truex Jr. last year, I'm pretty sure he can put his arm around Kyle Larson and say, you could run over some in Kansas and have a slow leak and then hit the wall early in the race, and then you find yourself behind the 8 ball. But until you actually see that, you can't handicap that. So I will say that I'm a little concerned for Tyler Reddick, but we're also seeing a higher price on him than we've seen in the past. When it comes to Kyle Larson and just the points in general, I think Larson's going to be safe if he just runs a solid race. But ultimately, we don't know. I think that the guys that clearly need to be concerned are the Chase Briscoes, the Austin Cindrics, the Daniel Suarez. But they're coming to 2 tracks where if there were 2 tracks where you needed someone out of nowhere to find speed or to actually get points and score finishes, this is it. If you're Austin Cindric, you have to be excited about the next few races. If you're Chase Briscoe or you're Daniel Suarez, you're excited about the next 2 races. Who's not excited? Denny Hamlin, Kyle Larson, Alex Bowman, Chase Elliott, because there's just so much that can happen, in these next few weeks. Ultimately, I do think that you're right about this William Byron deal. If you're just solid the next 2 weeks, you would think he can just kind of get home. He's 34 points to the good. Ryan Blaney also very good at these super speedway races, 28 points to the good. Chris Bell is an interesting one. I would say you have to make him the favorite, and I know that some sports books have made him the favorite in kind of that 2-3 to 1 range, just because he's so good at Phoenix. We're a long ways from Phoenix. We have.
There's a lot that can happen.
There's a lot that can happen. So this short price on Chris Bell, though I understand why it's short, I don't know that you should be running to the window to make that bet, because you have 2 question mark races, and then you have, I would say, the 3 races that are going to be indicative of how things could go at Phoenix, and a lot can happen between now and then.
Yeah, I mean, as I go through and try and make a case for any driver, if I had to bet somebody, which of course we don't, no one's holding a gun to our head, we're not forced to do any of this kind of stuff, but for argument's sake, when I look at all the prices here, we know historically how well Penske has run when it comes to Talladega, and it's where Ryan Blaney got the win. We talked about him last year. Unfortunately, neither of us added him to our portfolio. Joey Logano at 16-1. I'm not sure I can get there, but I guess if I'm making a case for anybody right now in that 10-1, 12-1 range, it would probably be Chase Elliott. I like what I've seen at the 1.5-mile tracks from Chase. It's been arguably where he's been at his best. He hasn't shown a ton of race-winning speed, but if that light bulb goes on and that entire HMS team starts to turn a corner, he's a guy that I trust not to go out there and make a mistake. If he's got a late restart, he can get to the front. I'd be much more likely to back him at a price of 10-1 or 12-1 than Alex Bowman, who's been the model of consistency, who I just don't see having the capabilities of going out and winning a race at Martinsville when he may need it the most, at Homestead or at Las Vegas.
That's a good point.
Famous last words, of course, but that would be the only guy that I'd be close to, at least going into Talladega, that I would consider adding, knowing that we're sitting on Chase Briscoe at an aggressive number.
Yeah, I would say the only thing about Chase Elliott is there's been very few times throughout the season where I've actually pointed him out as like, okay, that's the best car right now. I would say it's happened, I would say a handful of laps all season. As someone that watches every lap of every race, especially the lap times, very few times has Chase Elliott been the guy to beat. Now, I know he did get a win earlier in the year, but that was more of a circumstance of track position. So I do think Chase's consistency definitely has some upside. However, an engine failure in practice, going at the rear, he recovered nicely. He did what Chase Elliott needed to do, didn't try to do too much. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't hate Joey Logano. I think he was shockingly strong, actually, at this last week. I thought Ryan Blaney was probably the best car at Kansas. Joey Logano was also very strong. But I think you just got to survive the next 2 weeks. And once, I think we'll have a much clearer picture. Obviously, we're going to lose 4 drivers as we head into Las Vegas after these next 2 races. And I think that's when the playoff starts. That's when, for me, the betting playoff starts. Sure, you can take a shot on a guy like Austin Cindric this week. It was a chance who scored a lot of points at restrictor-plate races or superspeedway races. And then going into a road course, yes, I do think a guy like Austin Cindric, sure, if you're going to get interested, you should get interested now because things could go his way. I would not be taking anyone at a short price. But then again, if you have Austin Cindric and he makes it to the next round, how realistic is that through Las Vegas, Homestead, and then Martinsville? I just don't see it. So although you might be capturing some value, I don't know that you can realistically cash that, if that makes sense, right? Like Austin Cindric, yeah, he could make it through these next 2 races. I don't see him making it to the Final Four. Whereas a guy like Alex Bowman, Joey Logano, Chase Elliott, those guys actually have a more realistic chance of making it to the Final Four and also dodging, for lack of a better term, bullets in these next 2 races.
Well, and here's the one thing, too, if people are looking at historical indicators and trying to identify, well, you want a guy that is racing well and current form is indicative of what we're going to see. Last year, Ryan Blaney, Werme, before he won Talladega in the postseason, had gone 15 races, going all the way back to Sonoma, where he had no finish better than 9th. Suddenly, he wins at Talladega, and the rest is history when you look at how he finished out the season. With a win at Dega, he comes home at the Roval, where he could basically coast 12th, then 6th at Vegas, 2nd at Homestead, wins Martinsville, and then comes home 2nd in Phoenix behind Ross Chastain. So all it takes is one race to spark you, and it's part of the reason why when you're looking at these odds that are out there, no reason to bet any of these guys at short prices, knowing that everything will reset going into the next phase.
I would say you can say that about a guy like Ryan Blaney. I don't think you can say it about Austin Cindric. I don't think you can say it about Daniel Suarez. Chase Briscoe, gosh, I don't know if it's just my bias, the fact that I have some of him at 200.
You're not running bet him, though, at 80 right now. Let's not sugarcoat it. It's a guy that somehow finds a way to catch lightning in a bottle and luck box his way to Phoenix or earn his way there. Then you know he's going to have more than a puncher's chance, given the fact that it's one of his better tracks. Now, how the 14 will run at these 1.5-mile tracks, that remains to be seen. And can he replicate his run at Darlington on a true 1.5-mile at Homestead? I think that becomes his best shot, but he's going to have to string together 2 outstanding performances at Talladega and then, of course, at the Roval to even have this discussion and not make that ticket yet another tax write-up.
Yeah, I think, this is, we've said this, I think, since the end of last year when the playoff format came out or the playoff schedule came out. Just, gosh, so many unknowns. And here we are sitting in the second round going, well, we don't know. If a playoff driver had won at Kansas, yes, that would be a massive leg up. We didn't see that. And quite frankly, I didn't think that was much of an option going into the race after seeing practice and qualifying. I thought that we were going to see a playoff driver win. However, Ross Chastain gets the win. No playoff drivers locked into the next round. We have an even bigger unknown heading into these last two races, where we're eventually going to get to 8 drivers, where I think the playoffs actually start. So I do think that, after the Roval, once we've seen the unknowns kind of unfold, I do think that there might be some potential for some value heading into the last 4 races of the season.
Makes a ton of sense. You can follow Chris on social media at ChrisWerme15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. You can also follow our guest at Jeff_Gluck. That's JEFF_GLUCK. I know if you're a NASCAR fan, you've heard and read a lot of Jeff's content through The Athletic, what he does with Dirty Mo Media and the Teardown podcast with Jordan Bianchi after every single race. And again, most importantly, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Worms are normally its best bet time, but since we don't have one here, we'll have to come back guns a-blazing, and hopefully there's a little bit of pre-week opportunity at the Roval for us. And like you predicted last week, look, if we don't get closing line value on a bet that we give out on the podcast of Martin Truex Jr., it's no doubt going to be a winner. It took a little bit of luck, but Truex ends up getting the best of Kyle Busch. Unfortunately, the bet we posted on the website, Chris Buescher had a good run, but it's tough to win a head-to-head matchup when the driver you're fading ends up driving his car to victory lane. So we'll see what we can do. We'll try and finish with a flourish, but anything else you'd like to share before we decide to take a little bit of a break and reconvene next week as we head to Charlotte?
I just feel super fortunate to have Gluck on today. I mean, this is one of the guys in the know when it comes to something like this in NASCAR. I feel pretty fortunate that he was able to come on and make the time. It wasn't easy with all the different things going on with his obligations and just
snafus on our end.
And then we won't go there, but yes, it was very fortunate to have Jeff on, and appreciate him taking the time and kind of peeling back the curtain a little bit on what he's heard to something that's above our heads and right up his alley. So feel very. I mean, I was explaining to the people around me, like, you don't know, like, we have like the guy coming on our podcast today, and we didn't even know that was going to happen. So I appreciate Jeff coming on.
No doubt about it. Best of luck to all of you, our loyal Stay Green listeners. Should you choose to invest or watch at Talladega as a fan this weekend, if you do have a little skin in the game, hopefully we'll see you at the window.